The stagecoach lurched violently as it navigated another bend in the rocky canyon, throwing Sarah McKinnon against the worn leather seat. She clutched her black mourning dress, the fabric still stiff and new, purchased hastily in Denver just 3 weeks after burying her husband. The other passengers, a mining supply merchant, 2 soldiers, and an elderly couple heading to California, had long since given up attempting conversation with the young widow who kept her eyes fixed on the endless red rocks and silver-tinged plains rolling past. The November wind carried the sharp scent of sage and early snow, whistling through the gaps in the coach doors. Sarah pulled her woolen shawl tighter, though the chill she felt went deeper than any mountain cold could reach. At 26, she was returning east to Boston, to a life she no longer wanted but saw no alternative to: maiden aunts, tea services, and pitying glances from society matrons who would whisper about poor Sarah McKinnon, widowed so young in that dreadful frontier. The driver's shout pierced her reverie. "Hold up, everyone down!" Before Sarah could process the words, gunfire erupted. The coach tilted sharply as horses screamed and the driver tumbled from his perch. Through the window, she glimpsed masked riders emerging from behind the canyon walls like specters, their weapons glinting in the pale afternoon sun. "Out, everyone, out now!" A bandit yanked open the door, his face hidden behind a dirty bandana. The soldiers reached for their sidearms but were quickly overpowered. Sarah found herself pushed out with the others, her boots sinking into the cold dirt. The elderly woman beside her whimpered prayers while the merchant fumbled with his watch chain, eager to surrender his valuables. That's when she saw him, the Cherokee Irish scout who joined them at the last way station. Jacob Thorne moved with deadly grace, his revolver already drawn. He took down 2 bandits before an arrow whistled through the air, catching him in the shoulder and pinning him against the overturned coach with a sickening thud. "No!" The word tore from Sarah's throat before she could stop it. In the chaos that followed, bandits rifling through luggage, passengers scattering, more gunshots, Sarah found herself crawling toward the fallen scout. Blood bloomed across his leather vest, soaking into the splintered wood behind him. His green eyes, startling against his sun-weathered face and dark hair, met hers with surprising clarity. "Get away!" he gasped. "They'll be back." But Sarah's hands were already working, tearing strips from her petticoat with a determination that surprised even her. The black mourning dress that had felt like a shroud moments ago now seemed absurdly impractical as she pressed the fabric against his wound. Warm blood covered her hands, its metallic scent mixing with gunpowder and sage. The bandits were fleeing now, their saddlebags heavy with stolen goods. The soldiers lay motionless. The elderly couple had vanished into the canyon. Only Sarah remained, her city-soft hands trying desperately to stem the flow of blood from a stranger's wound. "Can you walk?" She studied the arrow shaft, knowing she couldn't remove it here. "There has to be shelter nearby." Jacob's laugh was more cough than humor. "Lady, you need to run. Get to Fort Bridger. I'm done for." "You're not." The firmness in her voice startled them both. Sarah had never been particularly brave, had married William McKinnon precisely because he offered safety and propriety. But something about this moment, this man's blood on her hands, awakened a fierceness she didn't recognize. "I'm not leaving you here to die," using skills she didn't know she possessed. Sarah fashioned a travois from broken coach planks and her own cloak. Every moment felt borrowed from death as she struggled to move Jacob's solid frame onto the makeshift stretcher. He tried to help, gritting his teeth against the pain, but she could see consciousness flickering in his eyes like a candle in wind. The canyon walls offered no comfort, but she remembered passing an abandoned mining shack perhaps 2 miles back. 2 miles through rough terrain, dragging a dying man. With night falling and the temperature dropping, Sarah had once complained about walking 3 blocks to church in Boston. Now she wrapped the travois poles in strips torn from her dress and began to pull. The journey blurred into a nightmare of stones catching at her boots, Jacob's labored breathing, and the howl of wind through the canyon, Her shoulders screamed. Her hands, despite her kid gloves, blistered and bled. Once, Jacob stirred enough to mutter something in what might have been Cherokee. Another time, he called for someone named Mary. When the shack finally appeared through the gathering dusk, a pathetic structure of weathered boards and stones, Sarah nearly wept with relief. The door hung on one hinge, and inside, she found only the remnants of long-abandoned dreams: a scarred wooden table, a stone fireplace black with old soot, a narrow cot with moldy straw ticking. But it had walls, it had a roof. It would have to do. Sarah dragged Jacob inside and somehow managed to transfer him to the cot. His skin burned with fever, the arrow still grotesquely protruding from his shoulder. In the dying light, she could see his face properly for the first time. The strong jaw, the premature lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years squinting into harsh sun, the unexpected gentleness in features that mixed two proud peoples. She searched the shack with desperate efficiency. A few rusty tools, a tin of ancient coffee, matches, blessed matches, in a tarnished silver case. As she built a fire with wood scraps and old furniture, Sarah made rapid calculations. Fort Bridger was at least 2 days by coach, longer on foot. The storm building outside promised snow by morning. No one would come looking for them. She was just another Eastern widow, and he was just another scout. If she waited for rescue, Jacob Thorne would die. The fire caught, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. Sarah knelt beside the cot, studying the man who'd tried to save them all. His breathing had gone shallow and ragged, like sand scraping against stone. She found his pulse at his throat, weak but stubborn, like a thread connecting him to life. "I'll keep you alive," she whispered, the words emerging like instinct, like prayer, like promise. Her proper Boston accent sounded strange in this wild place, but the vow felt more real than any she'd spoken in church. "Do you hear me? I'll keep you alive." The storm hit just after full dark. Snow sifted through gaps in the walls while wolves howled somewhere in the distance. Sarah realized with a practical clarity that surprised her. If she was going to keep this man from freezing to death, propriety would have to be abandoned along with her mourning clothes. She shed the heavy wool dress, standing in her chemise and corset. The cold bit immediately at her exposed skin, but when she lay down beside Jacob on the narrow cot, pressing her body against his fever-hot frame, sharing what warmth she had, the impropriety of it seemed as distant as Boston's cobblestone streets. His body shook with chills despite the burning skin. Sarah held him as she'd never held her own husband, with desperate purpose, her arms wrapped around his chest, feeling each labored breath, willing her own life force into him. The wind screamed outside. The fire needed constant feeding, but she didn't move except to add wood, always returning to her post as guardian against the cold and the dark and death itself. Sometime near dawn, Jacob's fever spiked higher. He thrashed, speaking broken words in English and Cherokee, calling again for Mary, for his mother, for mercy. Sarah held him tighter, whispering senseless comfort, her lips close to his ear. "Stay with me. Stay here. I've got you." When the pale mountain dawn finally crept through the cracks, Sarah was still awake, still counting his breaths, still holding the thread of his pulse beneath her fingers. The blood on his shoulder had dried dark and ugly. He would need water, medicine, food she didn't have, but he was alive. They had survived the first night. Sarah carefully extracted herself from the cot, her limbs stiff with cold and cramped position. She rebuilt the fire, melted snow in a dented pot she'd found, and began the delicate process of cleaning his wound with torn petticoat strips. The arrow would have to stay for now. She knew that much from novels, at least, but she could keep it clean, keep him warm, keep death at bay 1 hour at a time. As she worked, Sarah caught sight of herself in a broken mirror propped in the corner. The proper Boston widow was already fading, hair wild, face smudged with soot and blood, eyes holding something new and fierce. She looked like a stranger. She looked, perhaps, like someone who could keep an impossible promise. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them into this crude shelter with only each other and whatever strength they could find. Sarah pressed her hand once more to Jacob's throat, feeling that precious pulse, and began preparing for their second day of survival. The fever raged through Jacob like a prairie fire, consuming him from within while the winter storm battered the shack from without. Sarah fought back with the few weapons she had, cool cloths on his burning forehead, spoonfuls of melted snow pressed between his cracked lips, and the willow bark tea she remembered her grandmother brewing for fevers back in Boston. She'd found the willow bark by pure providence, dried bundles hanging from a nail as if some previous occupant had known someone would need them. The bitter brew seemed to help, though Jacob fought her every time she tried to make him drink, his head thrashing weakly against the thin pillow she'd fashioned from her petticoat. "Please," she murmured, supporting his head with one hand while tipping the cup with the other. "Just a little more. For me." His eyes flickered open at those striking green eyes that seemed to hold forests and storms. For a moment, clarity returned. "You stayed," he rasped, as if this simple fact defied all logic. "Of course I stayed." Sarah set down the cup and adjusted the blanket around him, her own cloak, since the moldy bedding was useless. Someone has to keep you from dying out of sheer stubbornness. A ghost of a smile touched his lips before the fever pulled him under again. The shack became her entire world. She learned its every gap and draft, stuffing cracks with mud mixed with dried grass, using precious fabric from her dress to seal the worst holes. The storm had left them with one blessing. Snow could be melted for water, but food was another matter. She'd found only ancient coffee, hard beans that might have been there for years, and a few strips of jerky tough as leather. On the second night, as she built up the fire with pieces of broken furniture, Jacob spoke again. The arrow. He managed. "Has to come out." Sarah's hand stilled. She'd been dreading this, knowing it was necessary but terrified of causing more damage. "I don't know how. I could kill you. Already dying," he said with that bitter humor she was beginning to recognize. "Cherokee grandmother taught me. Listen." Over the next hour, between bouts of fevered rambling, Jacob managed to give her instructions. Boil water. Sterilize her sewing knife in the flames. Cut the shaft close to the skin. Push it through rather than pull it back. The arrowhead was barbed. Have bandages ready. Work fast. Sarah's hands shook as she prepared. This was nothing like the delicate embroidery she'd learned at finishing school. But when she looked at Jacob's face, pale beneath his sun-weathered color, she found steel in her spine she didn't know existed. "I'm ready," she lied. The procedure was a nightmare of blood and Jacob's bitten-off screams. Sarah worked with desperate efficiency, following his gasped instructions, pushing the arrow through while he gripped the bed frame so hard the old wood cracked. When the bloodied arrowhead finally emerged from his back, she nearly fainted from relief. "Good," Jacob panted as she packed the wounds with clean cloth and the last of the willow bark. "You'd make a fair frontier doctor." "Don't talk," Sarah ordered, but she was fighting tears. His pain had become hers somewhere in these long hours, as if their struggle had bound them in ways she didn't understand. She settled him as comfortably as possible, then dealt with the bloody evidence of her crude surgery. It was only when she sat back by the fire, exhausted beyond measure, that she realized Jacob was watching her with those unsettling eyes. "Why?" he asked simply. Sarah understood. Why had a proper Boston widow stayed with a stranger? Why risk her reputation, her safety, her life? She thought of William, her late husband. Kind, steady William, who'd never stirred her heart but had offered security. Their marriage bed had been dutiful and distant. Two polite strangers sharing space but never truly touching. "Because," she said finally, "leaving you would have been murder, And I've lived with enough small deaths already." He studied her for a long moment, then closed his eyes, but his hand moved slightly on the blanket. An invitation. Sarah hesitated, then placed her own hand over his. His fingers were calloused from years of hard living, so different from William's soft merchant hands. But they were warm, alive. By the third day, routine emerged from chaos. Morning, rebuild the fire. Check wounds. Force Jacob to drink willow bark tea. Midday, melt snow. Attempt to make the rock-hard beans edible. Change bandages. Evening, gather more wood from broken furniture. Read from her small book of Tennyson's poetry, the only luxury she'd kept in her traveling bag. Her voice, soft in the flickering firelight, seemed to calm him. It little profits that an idle king, by this still hearth, among these barren crags. "You read beautifully," Jacob said one evening, more lucid than he'd been in days. The fever was breaking at last, leaving him weak but clear-eyed. "My one accomplishment," Sarah replied with gentle self-mockery. "That and pouring tea without spilling. You saved my life." "Not yet," she said firmly. "You're still too weak to declare victory." But she smiled as she said it, and he caught that smile, held it like a gift. They began to talk during his lucid periods. Jacob told her about his Cherokee grandmother who'd taught him to read sign, the language of bent grass and broken twigs, how to tell time by the shadows on stone. His Irish father had been a horse trader, wandering between worlds, belonging fully to neither. "So I became a scout," Jacob said, always watching the edges of things. Sarah found herself sharing too, about Boston's suffocating proprieties, about marriage to a man old enough to be her father, about the relief and guilt she'd felt when William's heart gave out in his counting house. "He was kind," she said carefully. "I want to be clear about that. Never cruel, just—" "Empty," Jacob supplied. "Yes?" The word hung between them like recognition. One night, the wolves came close. Sarah woke to their howling just outside the walls, Jacob's hand tight on her wrist. "Stay quiet," he breathed. "They're just curious." She could hear them snuffling at the door, testing. Jacob's free hand moved to the rusty rifle propped by the bed, another fortunate find in the shack, but after long minutes, the pack moved on, leaving only silence and Sarah's pounding heart. "Were you frightened?" Jacob asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp out here. It's the ones who stop being afraid who die first." Strange comfort, but Sarah understood. Fear had kept her moving through that first terrible night. Fear and something else, determination, perhaps, or simply the novel sensation of being needed for something real. As Jacob grew stronger, their roles shifted slightly. He could sit up now, direct her in small tasks, how to set a simple snare for rabbits, how to read weather in cloud formations, how to bank a fire to last through the night. Sarah proved a quick student, her hands adapting from needlework to necessities. "You're not what I expected from a Boston lady," he said one afternoon, watching her expertly skin a rabbit she'd caught. "What did you expect?" "Fainting, tears, demands to be taken to civilization immediately." Sarah considered this as she worked. 3 weeks ago, you'd have been right, but that woman feels like a stranger now. Who are you instead?" She looked up from her task, meeting his eyes steadily. "I don't know yet, but I think I'm finding out." That night, as had become their custom for warmth and practicality, Sarah lay beside Jacob on the narrow cot, but something had shifted. She was acutely aware of his breathing, of the solid warmth of his body recovering its strength. When he turned slightly toward her, she didn't pull away. "Sarah," he said quietly, "when we get out of here, and we will get out, what then?" She knew what he was asking. The world outside would have opinions about a widow who'd spent weeks alone with a half-breed scout, sharing his bed however innocently. Her reputation would be ruined. Her welcome in Boston society ended. "I don't know." she said honestly. But I can't imagine going backward after this. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining. Not passion, not yet, just connection, recognition. Two souls who'd found each other in the space between heartbeats, between life and death. Sleep, Jacob murmured. Tomorrow we start planning how to get down this mountain. But Sarah lay awake a while longer, feeling the pulse in his wrist against hers, marveling at how a promise made in desperation, "I'll keep you alive," had become something larger. She'd meant to save him. She hadn't expected him to return the favor. Outside, the wind had gentled. Spring was still weeks away. But something in the air had changed. The worst was passing. They would survive this. What came after? That remained to be written. Their days fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Mornings began with Sarah checking Jacob's wounds. The angry red had faded to pink, the flesh knitting together with surprising speed. She'd become efficient with bandages, her movements sure and gentle. No longer the trembling city woman who'd first pressed fabric to his bleeding shoulder. "You've got healing hands," Jacob told her one morning as she worked. "My grandmother would have said you were born to it." "More like necessity taught me," Sarah replied, but she was pleased. In Boston, she'd been ornamental, a pretty face at dinner parties, a graceful dancer, a pleasant companion who never spoke of serious things. Here, her hands had purpose. After the morning tending came breakfast, usually a thin porridge made from the dwindling beans, flavored with wild herbs Jacob taught her to identify from the doorway. Then the daily tasks gathering firewood from the furniture they broke piece by careful piece, melting snow for water. Checking the snares Sarah had learned to set with increasing skill. "Rabbit again," she announced one afternoon, returning triumphant with her catch. "I'm becoming quite the hunter." Jacob smiled from his seat by the fire. He could move around now, though Sarah still fretted when he pushed too hard. "Next I'll teach you to shoot. Can't have you depending on snares alone." The rifle lessons began that very day. Sarah had never held a gun before, had actively avoided William's hunting parties. But Jacob was patient, positioning her arms, teaching her to breathe, to squeeze rather than pull. "It's like everything out here," he said, standing close behind her as she aimed at a makeshift target. "Respect it, understand it, but don't fear it." The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder the first time, but her shot wasn't far off the mark. By the third day of practice, she could hit what she aimed at more often than not. Natural talent. Jacob declared, "Natural stubbornness," Sarah corrected, but she was smiling. Evenings were for reading. Sarah's volume of Tennyson was wearing thin from handling. But neither tired of the words. Jacob had been educated sporadically. Mission schools, his Irish father's teachings, his grandmother's oral traditions. But his mind was sharp, catching nuances in the poetry that Sarah had missed despite years of finishing school. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. He quoted one night, "That could be our motto." "Our?" Sarah asked softly. He looked at her across the fire, his green eyes serious. "If you'll have me, after this." It was the closest they'd come to speaking of the future beyond survival. Sarah's heart beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. "Read the next section," she said, neither accepting nor refusing. Not yet. But that night, when they lay together for warmth, she found herself studying the planes of his face in the firelight. The strong jaw, the premature lines that spoke of weather and worry, the unexpected gentleness in his expression when he thought she wasn't looking. Her husband, William, had been handsome in a soft, unremarkable way. Jacob was something else entirely, carved by wind and sun and struggle into something essential. "You're staring," he murmured without opening his eyes. "How do you know?" "I can feel it." A smile touched his lips. "My grandmother said people's gazes have weight. Yours feels warm." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. In Boston, Such directness would have been scandalous. Here, it felt honest, real. Sleep, she said, echoing his words from nights past. But his hand found hers under the blanket, and neither slept for a long while. The next morning brought a gift. Clear skies and actual sunshine streaming through the gaps in the walls. Jacob declared himself well enough for a longer expedition, and together they ventured out to explore their immediate surroundings. The world outside was transformed. Snow blanketed everything in pristine white, turning the harsh landscape into something magical. Sarah had seen snow in Boston, of course, but never like this, untouched, unmarked except for animal tracks, stretching endlessly toward mountains that scraped the sky. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "And dangerous," Jacob reminded her, but gently. Beauty kills more folks out here than ugliness. They get entranced, forget to watch for signs. He taught her as they walked, slowly, mindful of his still healing shoulder, how to read the age of tracks, how to spot avalanche danger in the way snow clung to slopes, how to find direction without a compass. Sarah absorbed it all, understanding that this knowledge was currency more valuable than gold in this wild place. They found a small cave that might serve as emergency shelter, marked it mentally, located a spring that would run clear once the snow melted, identified game trails and the scratches that meant bear territory, though the bears should be sleeping still. "You're teaching me to survive without you," Sarah observed as they made their way back to the shack. Jacob stopped walking, turned to face her in the snow. "I'm teaching you to survive, period, with or without me. That's what partners do." "Partners," she repeated, tasting the word. "If that's what you want." His voice was careful, but his eyes held heat. "I know what the world would say. A proper widow and a half-breed scout. But the world isn't here. We are." Sarah looked at him, really looked. Not at the Cherokee features or the Irish eyes or the rough clothes. At the man who'd trusted her with his life, who'd taught her strength she didn't know she possessed, who looked at her like she was something precious but never fragile. "The world has been wrong about a lot of things," she said finally. Something shifted in his expression. Hope, perhaps. But before either could speak again, the wind picked up, driving them back to shelter. That evening, Jacob carved while Sarah prepared dinner. She'd discovered he was clever with his hands, necessity again, and he was fashioning something from a piece of pine they'd saved from the fire. "What is it?" she asked, curious. "Wait and see." When he finished, he held out his creation, a wooden comb, its teeth carefully spaced, the handle worn smooth. "Your hair," he said simply. "I notice you struggling with the tangles. Thought this might help." Sarah took the gift with hands that trembled slightly. In Boston, she'd owned ivory combs, silver brushes, all manner of expensive toiletries, but nothing had ever felt as precious as this simple wooden comb carved by firelight. "Thank you," she whispered. "Let me," Jacob offered, gesturing to her hair. Another line to cross, another propriety to abandon. Sarah turned her back to him, unpinning what remained of her once elaborate coiffure. Her hair fell in dark waves, tangled from weeks of neglect. Jacob's hands were infinitely gentle as he worked the comb through the knots. Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the warmth of the fire, the soft pull of the comb, the intimacy of this simple act of care. "My grandmother used to say a woman's hair holds her power," Jacob murmured as he worked. "That's why Cherokee women keep theirs long. Cut it only for mourning." "I've been in mourning," Sarah said softly, "but not for William, for the life I thought I was supposed to want." The comb stilled. Then Jacob's hands were on her shoulders, turning her to face him. "And now I want this," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "This life, this place, this—" "This," he prompted, his face very close to hers. "You," she finished, barely a whisper. The kiss was inevitable as sunrise, soft at first, tentative, as if both were afraid the other might pull away. Then, deeper, Sarah's hands tangling in his dark hair, Jacob's arms pulling her close despite his healing shoulder. It tasted of wood smoke and promises, of survival and choice. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure this changes everything?" Sarah laughed, soft and certain. "Everything already changed the moment I said I'd keep you alive." They sat together by the fire after that, Sarah between Jacob's knees, his arms around her as she leaned back against his chest. The wooden comb rested in her lap, a tangible promise of the future they were choosing. "We'll need to leave soon," Jacob said eventually. "Snow's starting to break. A few more days, maybe a week, and we can make it down to the settlements." "I know." Sarah traced patterns on his arm. "Are you ready for what comes next?" "Fighting the world for you, been ready for that since you dragged me through a blizzard." His voice held humor, but underneath was steel. "Question is, are you ready? It won't be easy." "Nothing about this has been easy," Sarah pointed out. "But it's been real. More real than anything in my life before." She turned in his arms to look at him directly. "I choose this. Choose you. Let them talk." Jacob kissed her again, sealing the promise. Outside, the wind howled its ancient song. But inside their rough shelter, two people who should never have met planned a future that defied every expectation. The fire burned low as they talked, practical plans mixed with dreams. Where they might settle, what kind of life they could build, how to face the challenges that would surely come. And through it all, Sarah felt a certainty settling into her bones. She'd promised to keep him alive, but somewhere in these weeks of struggle and survival, Jacob Thorne had returned the favor. The proper Boston widow was gone. In her place sat a woman who could shoot, trap, survive, and love with a fierce certainty that would have shocked her former self. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The world waited beyond the snow with all its judgments and obstacles. But tonight, in this moment, Sarah McKinnon and Jacob Thorne were simply two souls who'd found each other in the space between heartbeats. And that was enough. That was everything. The morning sun spilled through the cracks like honey, pooling on the rough wooden table where Jacob sat whittling. His movements were careful, precise, the knife peeling away curls of pine in rhythmic strokes. Sarah watched from across the small space, her coffee, more memory than substance now, warming her hands. "Another gift?" she asked, though she'd learned not to press. Jacob revealed his creations in his own time. "Something like that." He glanced up, and the look in his green eyes made her breath catch. These past days, since their first kiss, every glance held weight. Every casual touch sparked like flint on steel. They'd maintained a careful distance, even while sharing the narrow cot for warmth. Not from lack of desire. Sarah felt it humming between them like a taut wire, but from something deeper. Respect, perhaps, or the understanding that what was building between them deserved more than desperate coupling in a drafty shack. "I was thinking," Jacob said, returning to his carving, "about what you said, about your marriage being empty." His hands stilled. "I want you to know, if we do this, if we make this choice, I'll never give you empty. I might give you difficult, might give you struggle, but never empty." Sarah set down her cup and moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I've had comfortable emptiness. I prefer difficult fullness." He smiled at that, the expression transforming his weather-carved features. "You've got away with words. Boston." "Former Boston," she corrected. "I can't imagine going back to being that woman." "Who are you now, then?" Sarah considered. These weeks had stripped away so much. The propriety, the fear, the careful masks she'd worn. What remained felt essential, like bone. I'm someone who knows what she wants and isn't afraid to choose it. Jacob set aside his whittling, turning to face her fully. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And what do you want?" "This moment," she said simply, "and all the moments after." The kiss was different this time, deeper, more certain. Sarah's hands found the gaps in his shirt, feeling the warm skin beneath, the steady beat of his heart. Jacob's fingers tangled in her hair, loosened by the wooden comb he'd made. When he pulled back, both were breathing hard. "Sarah," he said, her name a question and a prayer. "Yes," she answered, to whatever he was asking, to all of it. But even as heat built between them, Jacob's hands were gentle, reverent. He unpinned her hair fully, letting it fall around her shoulders, then simply looked at her as if memorizing every detail. "You're so beautiful it hurts," he murmured. "But that's not why. It's your strength, your courage, the way you looked that first night, covered in my blood but refusing to leave." His voice roughened. "I think I started falling for you right then." Sarah's eyes burned with sudden tears. William had called her beautiful too, but as one might admire a painting, distantly, possessively. Jacob saw her, all of her, and found her worthy. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but also alive, for the first time in years, truly alive." They came together again, and this time, Sarah let herself feel everything. The scratch of his jaw against her cheek, the strength in his arms as he pulled her close, the way their bodies fit despite the awkward confines of the shack. His shoulder was still tender, and she was careful of it, but otherwise they moved as if they'd been lovers for years rather than minutes. Later, wrapped in blankets and each other, Sarah traced the scars on Jacob's chest, old wounds that told stories of a dangerous life. "Will you tell me about these?" "Someday," he promised. "When we have time, all the time in the world." I like the sound of that. They dozed as the afternoon sun tracked across the floor, waking to find the light going golden. Sarah had never felt such peace, such rightness. Her body ached pleasantly. Her heart felt full to bursting, and the man beside her looked at her like she'd hung the stars. "Regrets?" Jacob asked, reading something in her expression. "Only that we didn't do this sooner." He laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Patience has its rewards. Besides, you were busy keeping me alive." "And you were busy teaching me to live." She grew serious. "That's what you did. You know, these weeks. I was breathing before, existing, but not living." Jacob pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "The world out there won't understand. A widow's supposed to mourn for a year at least. And the other thing—" "Your blood," Sarah finished. "Let them gossip. I've learned there are worse things than scandal." "Like what?" "Like dying slowly in a pretty prison, like never knowing what it feels like to choose your own life." She propped herself up on an elbow to look at him. "I choose you. Jacob Thorne, today, tomorrow, whatever comes." He was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah saw the vulnerability in his eyes. This strong man who'd faced death countless times but was undone by her declaration. "I never thought—" he began, then stopped. "My Irish father loved my Cherokee mother, but the world made their life hell. I swore I'd never put someone through that." "I'm not someone," Sarah said firmly. "I'm me, and I'm tougher than I look. You taught me that." "That I did," he agreed, wonder in his voice. "My fierce Boston lady who can trap rabbits and shoot straight and drag a dying man through a blizzard." "Former Boston," she reminded him again, smiling. "Now I'm just Sarah. You're Sarah, if you'll have me." "If I'll have you," Jacob sat up, pulling her with him. "Woman, I'd fight every man from here to the Mississippi for you. Question is whether you really know what you're signing up for. Tell me, Sarah said simply. So he did. Told her about the reality of life on the frontier for a mixed-blood couple, the towns that wouldn't serve them, the hotels that would turn them away, the proper folk who'd cross streets to avoid them, the names they'd be called, the assumptions made. Sarah listened without interrupting, her hand in his, feeling each painful truth. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Is that all?" she finally asked. Jacob blinked. "All, Sarah, that's the worst the world can do. Refuse to serve us coffee, call us names." She laughed, but not unkindly. "Jacob, I've spent the last 3 weeks melting snow for water and eating rabbit I trapped myself. I've slept on a cot that would make prisoners weep. I've reset wounds and faced down wolves and learned to read tomorrow's weather and today's clouds." She squeezed his hand. "After all that, do you really think I care what some shopkeeper's wife thinks of me?" Jacob stared at her, then slowly began to smile. "You really don't, do you?" "Not one bit," Sarah confirmed. "The only opinion that matters to me is yours. Well, and my own. I've grown rather fond of my own opinion lately." "As you should be. It's a fine opinion." He pulled her back into his arms. "Sarah McKinnon, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known." "Sarah Thorne," she corrected softly. "If you'll have me. I know we can't make it legal until we reach a town, but in my heart—" Jacob's arms tightened around her. "Say that again." "Sarah Thorne," she repeated, tasting the name. "It suits me, don't you think?" "It suits you perfectly," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "And as soon as we find a preacher who'll do it, I'll make it official. Might have to ride a ways to find one willing, but—" Sarah silenced him with a kiss. "I don't care if we have to ride to California. I don't care if we have to say our vows in a barn with horses as witnesses. I just care that we do it." They spent the evening planning in earnest now. Not just survival, but a life. Jacob knew of good land near Denver, far enough from town to avoid the worst of the gossip, but close enough to trade. They could raise horses. He had the knowledge. And Sarah was learning fast. "I can teach school," Sarah offered. "Some of the frontier children might not care who their teacher married, as long as she can read and write." "And shoot," Jacob added with a grin. "Don't forget that skill. Might come in handy with unruly students." As night fell, they prepared for bed with new awareness. What had been necessity was now choice. When Sarah lay down beside him, it was as a lover, not just a survivor. The narrow cot that had once seemed a hardship now felt like a perfect fit. "I love you," Jacob said into the darkness. Simple words, but Sarah heard the weight of them, the promise, the wonder, the fierce protection. "I love you too," she replied, marveling at how easy it was to say. With William, love had been assumed, expected, never spoken. With Jacob, it was a living thing between them, as real as breath. Outside, the wind sang through the canyon, but gentler now. Spring was coming. Soon they'd leave this rough shelter that had become their entire world. But Sarah knew that whatever came next, they'd face it together. She'd promised to keep him alive, and she had. But somewhere between that first desperate night and this moment of perfect contentment, they'd done something more. They'd chosen to live, truly live. Consequences be damned. And that, Sarah thought as sleep claimed her, was the greatest gift of all. The storm struck with a vengeance that made their previous trials seem gentle. For 3 days, the wind howled like a living thing, driving snow through every gap in the walls until their little shack felt more like a sieve than a shelter. They burned furniture with grim efficiency. First the broken chair, then pieces of the table. Finally, even the wooden frame of an old mirror. "We're running out," Sarah said simply on the second night, looking at their dwindling pile of fuel. Jacob nodded, his face grave in the firelight. "Tomorrow we'll have to break apart the back wall, take the boards that aren't load-bearing." It was a calculated risk. Remove too much, and the whole structure might collapse. But without fire, they'd freeze before the storm passed. Their food situation was equally dire. Sarah had become an expert at stretching their meager supplies. But there was only so much she could do with a handful of beans and strips of jerky hard as leather. They cut their already small portions in half, then half again. One meal a day. Jacob decided, mid-afternoon, to carry us through the coldest part of the night. Sarah didn't argue. She'd learned to read the mathematics of survival in his eyes, the careful calculations of calories against cold, hope against reality. The discipline required was severe, but strangely bonding. They moved slowly to conserve energy, stayed wrapped in their blankets except when absolutely necessary, shared body heat with new desperation. Talk became a luxury they couldn't afford. Breath meant warmth lost to the air. On the third morning of the storm, Jacob slipped while gathering the snow just outside the door. Sarah heard the fall, the sharp intake of breath that meant pain. She found him struggling to rise, his face white. "My ankle," he gritted out. Together they managed to get him inside. The joint was already swelling, though Sarah couldn't tell if it was broken or merely twisted. She packed it with snow to reduce the swelling, tore more strips from her dwindling petticoat for bandaging. "This is bad," Jacob said unnecessarily. "We've had worse," Sarah replied, though fear gnawed at her stomach. An injured man in a blizzard with no food. Little fuel. She pushed the thoughts away. Panic was another luxury they couldn't afford. That night, as Jacob dozed fitfully, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps crunching in the snow outside. Not the random movement of animals, but the deliberate tread of a human. She reached for the rifle, checking the load with movements Jacob had taught her. Her hands were steady despite her racing heart. "Hello, the cabin." The voice was rough, male, unfamiliar, looking for shelter from the storm. Jacob's eyes snapped open. He tried to rise, but Sarah pressed him back with one hand, keeping the rifle trained on the door with the other. "State your business," she called, putting steel in her voice. A laugh, unpleasant. "That's no way to treat a fellow traveler. Ma'am, why don't you open up and we can discuss it civil-like?" Something in the voice, an oily quality beneath the friendliness, raised every alarm Sarah had developed these past weeks. She glanced at Jacob, saw her suspicions confirmed in his grim expression. "The storm's passing," she lied. "Best you move on." "Now that's not very Christian of you." The voice was closer now, right outside the door. "Pretty lady like you, all alone up here." "She's not alone," Jacob called, his voice carrying despite his weakness. "And you've got 3 seconds to move away from that door before she puts a bullet through it." Silence. Then footsteps retreating, followed by muttered curses. They waited, tense, for an hour before allowing themselves to relax slightly. "He'll be back," Jacob said quietly. "Men like that, they get ideas, especially about a woman up here." Sarah checked the rifle again, set it within easy reach. "Then I'll be ready." "You did good," Jacob told her. "Didn't show fear, didn't open the door. You've got the instincts for this life." "I had a good teacher," Sarah replied, but she was shaking now. Delayed reaction setting in. Jacob pulled her close with his good arm, and she let herself tremble against him for just a moment before straightening. "We need to set watches." They dozed in shifts through the rest of the night, but the stranger didn't return. By morning, the storm had begun to break, leaving behind a world scoured clean and deadly bright. Sarah ventured out cautiously, rifle in hand, to survey the damage. The lean-to they'd built for firewood had collapsed entirely. Worse, she found boot prints circling the shack. The stranger had indeed come back, testing for weaknesses. She also found something else. Wire from their snares had been cut. Deliberately. "He's trying to starve us out," Jacob said when she reported back. Probably figures a hungry woman is an easier target. He figured wrong, Sarah said flatly. Despite his injured ankle, Jacob insisted on teaching her to set trap alarms, simple arrangements of string and tin cans that would warn of approach. Sarah learned quickly, her fingers nimble despite the cold. As she worked, she thought about the woman she'd been just weeks ago, that Sarah would have opened the door, trusting in civility and social contracts, that Sarah would have been victim to whatever darkness the stranger carried. This Sarah knew better. The frontier had taught her that civilization was a thin veneer, easily stripped away, but it had also taught her she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. The next 2 days blended together in a haze of vigilance and hunger. The stranger didn't return, but his presence haunted the edges of their world. Sarah repaired the snares, caught nothing. Animals, too, had sheltered from the storm. Their last beans went into a watery soup that mocked their empty stomachs. "We need to move," Jacob said on the evening of the 5th day. "Storm's broken enough. His ankle's better, not healed, but he could manage with a walking stick. We can't wait for perfect conditions." Sarah knew he was right. Staying meant slow starvation or worse if the stranger returned with friends. But the journey down the mountain with Jacob injured and both of them weakened by hunger. "We'll go at first light," she decided. "I'll pack tonight." There was pitifully little to pack. The wooden comb, her tattered book of poetry, the knife that had saved Jacob's life, a few strips of jerky they'd been saving. The rest would stay. The memories soaked into the walls, the bloodstains on the floor, the ashes of furniture sacrificed for warmth. That last night in the shack, they held each other close, not for warmth but for courage. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but also hope, civilization, food, the chance to start the life they'd planned. "Are you afraid?" Jacob asked in the darkness. "Yes," Sarah admitted, "but not of the same things anymore. I used to fear being improper, being talked about, being less than perfect." She laughed softly. "Now I fear practical things. Starvation, freezing, men with bad intentions." "That's growth," Jacob said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Fear of real things instead of shadows." "I also fear losing you," she added quietly. "That's become the realest thing of all." His arms tightened around her. "You won't. I'm too stubborn to die now, after all the work you put into keeping me alive." Morning came gray and uncertain. Sarah helped Jacob fashion a walking stick from a broken board, wrapped his ankle tightly, shouldered their meager pack. The rifle was a comfortable weight in her hands now, as much a part of her as the wooden comb in her hair. They stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back at the rough shack that had been their world. "Thank you," Sarah said to the empty room. "For the shelter, for the time, for showing me who I could be." Jacob squeezed her hand. "Ready?" "Ready," she confirmed. They stepped out into the snow, leaving clear tracks pointing down the mountain. Sarah kept the rifle ready, scanning the tree line for movement. Jacob leaned heavily on his stick but kept pace, his jaw set against the pane. Behind them, smoke still rose from the chimney of the shack, a thin line connecting earth to sky. Ahead, the unknown waited, both terrible and wonderful, threatening and promising. But they faced it together, step by careful step. Two people who had found each other in the space between heartbeats and chosen to keep walking forward, no matter what came next. The frontier had tested them with cold and hunger, loneliness and fear. It would test them again with the judgment of civilization, the weight of different expectations. But Sarah knew now that they could survive it all. She'd promised to keep him alive. He'd taught her to live, together. They'd forged something new from the ashes of their old lives, as strong and enduring as the mountains themselves. The sun broke through the clouds as they descended, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. It felt like a blessing, or perhaps a promise. Either way, Sarah thought, adjusting the rifle and checking on Jacob's progress, They would make it true. The spring sun turned the mountain ice to diamonds, each surface throwing light like scattered coins. Sarah and Jacob had been walking for 2 days, following the creek that would eventually lead them to the valley and Fort Bridger. His ankle was holding up better than expected, though she could see the strain in the tight lines around his mouth. There. Jacob pointed to a thin column of smoke rising above the tree line. That'll be Hansen's lumber camp. Another mile, maybe 2. Sarah adjusted the rifle on her shoulder, scanning the forest edge from habit now. The stranger from the storm hadn't shown himself again, but she'd learned not to trust apparent safety. They heard the rescue party before they saw it. Horses snorting, men calling to each other, the jingle of tack and gear. Sarah's first instinct was relief. Her second was wariness. How would they appear to these men, a bedraggled widow and a wounded half-breed scout, clearly having spent weeks alone together? Ho there! The lead rider spotted them, spurring his mount forward. Sarah recognized him, Sergeant Mills from Fort Bridger, a decent man who'd always been respectful during the few times she'd encountered him at the fort while traveling with William. Mrs. McKinnon. His eyes widened with genuine shock. Lord Almighty, we thought you were dead, the whole stage party. The others? Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer. No other survivors, ma'am. Been searching these canyons for 2 weeks. His gaze shifted to Jacob, took in their closeness, the way Sarah automatically moved to support him over a rough patch. Something flickered in his expression, not quite judgment, but assessment. More riders appeared, circling them with the curious intensity of men who'd been searching for corpses and found life instead. Sarah straightened her shoulders, meeting their stares directly. Mr. Thorne saved my life, she said clearly. He was wounded in the attack. I've been tending him. For 2 weeks, ma'am. This from a younger soldier, his tone carrying implications. For as long as necessary, Sarah replied, steel in her voice. He would have died otherwise. Sergeant Mills dismounted, offering his horse to Jacob. Can you ride? Thorne. I can manage. Jacob accepted the help up with dignity, though Sarah saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the saddle horn. Another soldier offered his mount to Sarah. She accepted with grace, though after weeks of walking, the saddle felt strange and precarious. As they formed up for the ride back to the fort, she caught the looks exchanged between the men, heard the low murmurs. 2 weeks alone. Widow woman and a breed. Wonder what really on. Sarah kept her chin high, her gaze fixed ahead. Let them wonder. Let them gossip. She'd faced down blizzards and starvation and predators, both animal and human. Their whispers were nothing compared to that. The lumber camp appeared first, a collection of rough buildings and the screaming protest of saws through wood. Men stopped work to stare as they passed. Sarah felt their eyes like hands, assessing, judging. She moved her horse closer to Jacob's. Steady, he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. This is just the beginning. Fort Bridger materialized from the Wyoming landscape like a mirage. Wooden walls, fluttering flag, the promise of civilization. Sarah had passed through before with William, had found it rough and primitive. Now it looked impossibly grand. Word of their arrival preceded them. By the time they rode through the gates, a crowd had gathered. Sarah saw familiar faces from her westward journey. The sutler's wife who'd been kind about her mourning clothes. The lieutenant's lady who'd invited her for tea. Their expressions ranged from relief to curiosity to something harder to name. Sarah, oh my dear, Mrs. Colonel Patterson pushed through the crowd, the fort commander's wife and therefore the social arbiter of this small world. We must get you inside immediately. You poor thing, what you must have endured. She reached up to help Sarah dismount, then paused, her gaze taking in Sarah's appearance more fully, the shortened hair, The rough-patched dress, the sun-weathered face so different from the pale Boston beauty who'd passed through weeks before. "I'm quite well. Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said, dismounting on her own. "But Mr. Thorne needs medical attention. His wound—" Of course. Mrs. Patterson's smile grew fixed. "The doctor will see to Mr. Thorne. You must come with me. A hot bath, proper clothes, a good meal." Sarah glanced at Jacob, being helped toward the medical building by 2 soldiers. He caught her eye, nodded slightly. "Go." The look said, "Play the part for now." But as Sarah followed Mrs. Patterson, she felt the gulf opening between them already. The fort's society would try to reclaim her as one of their own, a widow to be protected, guided, eventually remarried to someone suitable. They wouldn't understand that the woman who'd left was gone, replaced by someone who knew how to set snares and dress wounds and face down darkness without flinching. The colonel's house was warm, civilized, overwhelming. Sarah sat in a copper tub while Mrs. Patterson's maid poured kettle after kettle of hot water, exclaiming over her calloused hands, her wind-chapped skin, the lean strength in arms that had dragged a man to safety. "Such an ordeal," Mrs. Patterson kept saying from behind a screen, giving Sarah privacy to bathe. "Of course, no one blames you for doing what was necessary to survive. Christian charity, caring for the wounded, though perhaps it would be best if we adjust the story slightly. For your own reputation. You understand." "Adjust it how?" Sarah asked, though she knew. "Oh, just small details. Perhaps there was a cave with separate chambers, or other survivors who unfortunately perished later, just to avoid any unpleasantness." Sarah sank deeper into the water, feeling weeks of dirt and struggle wash away. But also something else. The simple honesty of survival was already being rewritten into something more palatable. Clean and dressed in borrowed clothes that felt like costume now, Sarah was presented to the colonel for official questioning. She told the truth. The attack, the rescue, the weeks of survival. She didn't elaborate on what had grown between her and Jacob. That was private, sacred, not for official reports. "Remarkable," Colonel Patterson said when she finished. "Quite remarkable. You're to be commended. Mrs. McKinnon. Not many women would have shown such fortitude." "Thank you, Colonel." Sarah paused, then added, "I'd like to see Mr. Thorne to check on his condition." The colonel exchanged glances with his wife. "The doctor is with him. Perhaps tomorrow would be more appropriate. You need rest and, well, considerations of propriety." "Propriety?" Sarah tasted the word like something foreign. "Of course." But that night, after the household had retired, Sarah slipped out. She'd learned to move silently in the wilderness. Navigating a fort was child's play. She found Jacob in the medical building, his shoulder freshly bandaged, his face peaceful in sleep. She sat beside his bed, taking his hand. He stirred, eyes opening to find her. "You came," he said simply. "Where else would I be?" "Being feted as a heroine, I imagine. The brave widow who saved a life." "While you're what, the savage who compromised me?" Bitterness crept into her voice. Jacob squeezed her hand. "We knew this would happen. It's why I tried to send you away that first night." "And I told you then? I choose this. Choose you." Sarah leaned closer. "They want me to lie, to say we were never truly alone. Never." "Maybe you should," Jacob said quietly. "It would be easier. You could go back east, resume your life." Sarah silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her certainty into the contact. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide. "I'm not going anywhere without you," she said firmly. "Tomorrow. I'll make that clear. They can accept it or not. But I won't pretend these weeks didn't happen. I won't diminish what we survived, what we found, for the sake of their small minds. It won't be easy, Jacob warned again. Nothing about us has been easy, Sarah replied. But it's been real. It's been true. That matters more than easy. They sat together in the darkness, hands linked, preparing for the battles to come. Outside, the fort settled into sleep, unaware that in this small medical building, two people were choosing a future that would challenge every expectation. Tomorrow, Sarah would face the gossips and the guard of propriety. She would stand straight and declare her intentions, whatever the cost. But tonight, she simply sat with the man she loved, the one she'd kept alive and who had, in turn, taught her to live. The spring moon rose full and bright, painting silver squares on the wooden floor. Sarah thought of their shack in the mountains, of promises made by firelight, of a wooden comb and a book of poetry, and the space between heartbeats where two souls recognized each other. I love you, she whispered into the darkness. And I love you, Jacob replied. Whatever comes next. Whatever comes next. Sarah smiled, thinking of all the whatevers they'd already faced. This was just one more. And like all the others, they'd face it together. The chapel at Fort Bridger was a simple affair. Rough-hewn boards, backless benches, a cross fashioned from local pine. But to Sarah, standing at its threshold in a borrowed blue dress, it might as well have been a cathedral. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she surveyed the small gathering inside. Word had spread quickly through the fort about the widow McKinnon's intention to marry the half-breed scout. Some faces showed curiosity, others disapproval. A precious few offered tentative smiles. Mrs. Patterson sat rigidly in the front row, her expression suggesting she'd swallowed something bitter. You're certain about this? Reverend Carlyle asked quietly. He was a young man, new to the frontier, still wrestling with the gap between seminary teachings and frontier realities. There's no shame in taking more time to consider. I've had weeks to consider, Sarah interrupted gently. I'm certain. Jacob waited at the altar, his broad shoulders filling out a clean shirt someone had found for him. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. But it was his eyes that held Sarah, green as spring forests, warm with love and promise. She walked toward him alone. No one had offered to give her away, and she hadn't asked. This choice was hers to make, hers to own. Dearly beloved, Reverend Carlyle began, his voice carrying over the rustling disapproval of some attendees. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Sarah McKinnon and Jacob Thorne. The ceremony was brief. They'd requested no flourishes, no lengthy sermons, just the essential words that would bind them in the eyes of God and law. When Jacob slipped the simple band on her finger, purchased from the sutler with his scout's wages, Sarah felt something settle in her chest. Complete, right. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Their kiss was modest, appropriate to the setting, but Sarah felt the promise in it. Later, it said, when we're alone, when we're free. The reception afterward was stilted. A few brave souls offered congratulations. Sergeant Mills shook Jacob's hand firmly, told Sarah she was a brave woman. The doctor who'd tended Jacob's wound wished them well with genuine warmth, but many hung back, whispering behind gloved hands. She couldn't even wait for proper mourning. A half-breed. Can you imagine? What will her family back east think? Sarah heard it all. Let it wash over her like rain over stone. These people and their opinions would be left behind soon enough. What mattered was the man beside her, the matching ring on his finger, the future they'd build together. That night, in the small quarters assigned to married scouts, Sarah and Jacob finally found themselves alone as husband and wife. The room was sparse but clean, with a proper bed, a small table, 2 chairs, luxury after their mountain shack. Are you happy? Jacob asked, watching as Sarah unpinned her hair, longer now, though still shorter than fashion dictated. Happier than I've ever been, she answered honestly. You? He crossed to her, cupped her face in his hands. I keep thinking I'll wake up, find myself back in that shack, fevered and dying, having dreamed it all. It's real, Sarah assured him, covering his hands with hers. We're real. They made love like survivors, like believers, like two people who'd found each other against all odds and weren't letting go. Afterward, lying entwined in the narrow bed, they talked of practical things. I've saved enough for a wagon and supplies, Jacob said. There's good land southeast of Denver, far enough from town to avoid the worst of the gossip. Close enough to trade. We could raise horses. I know bloodlines. And you've learned fast about animal care. I could teach. Sarah added, some of the frontier families might not care who their children's teacher married, as long as she can read and write and do sums. It won't be easy, Jacob said, his constant refrain. Stop saying that, Sarah chided gently. I know it won't be easy, but it will be ours. They left Fort Bridger 3 days later. Sarah had written to her sister in California, explaining her choice in terms that avoided apology. Jacob sent money to cousins back in Oklahoma Territory, a gesture of family obligation completed. They were free to begin fresh. The wagon was small but sturdy, loaded with supplies purchased with Jacob's savings and the small amount Sarah had carried west. Tools, seed, basic furniture makings, ammunition, the necessities of starting over. Some from the fort came to see them off. More stayed away. Mrs. Patterson made a point of being visibly elsewhere, but Sergeant Mills helped load the wagon, and the doctor pressed a medical kit into Sarah's hands. You've got healing hands, he said. Might find use for these where you're going. As they rolled out of the fort gates, Sarah didn't look back. Her eyes were on the horizon, on the mountains that had tested them and the plains that promised a future. Beside her, Jacob handled the team with easy competence, whistling a tune she didn't recognize. Cherokee, perhaps, or Irish, or something entirely his own. They traveled for 2 weeks, following established trails when possible, making their own path when necessary. Sarah had grown comfortable with the rifle across her lap, scanning for trouble that never came. The weather held fair. The nights grew warmer, and slowly the landscape transformed from mountain harsh to prairie wide. There, Jacob said one afternoon, pulling the team to a halt atop a small rise. Sarah looked where he pointed and felt her breath catch. A valley spread below them, green with spring grass. A creek wound through it, lined with cottonwoods. To the east, the land rose gently toward pine-covered hills. To the west, it opened onto prairie, perfect horse country. Home, she asked, if you want it. Sarah studied the land with eyes that had learned to read possibilities. Water, shelter, good grass, far enough from the main road for privacy, but not isolation. She could see it already, a house by the creek, corrals for the horses, maybe a garden where the soil looked richest. Yes, she said simply. Home. They made camp by the creek that night, sleeping under stars instead of in the wagon. The ground was softer than their mountain shack's floor had ever been, the air sweet with growing things instead of snow and smoke. Do you miss it? Sarah asked. The scouting life, the freedom to roam. Jacob was quiet for a moment. I thought I would. It's all I've known since I was 16, but somewhere in that shack, watching you learn to read tracks in snow, seeing you refuse to give up. He turned to face her. I realized I wasn't looking for freedom to roam. I was looking for somewhere to belong. And now I belong with you, wherever that is. Sarah kissed him under the vast western sky, tasting promise and commitment and the peculiar joy of choosing difficult over empty. Tomorrow they'd start the hard work of building, both a homestead and a life. There would be challenges she couldn't yet imagine, prejudices to face, acceptance to earn or do without. But tonight, lying beside the man she'd saved and who'd saved her in return, Sarah felt only certainty. They'd survived winter's worst, faced down death and emerged stronger. Whatever came next, they'd meet it as they'd met everything else, together, without apology, with the fierce love of two people who'd found each other in the space between heartbeats and refused to let go. The creek sang its ancient song. The horses grazed peacefully nearby, and Sarah Thorne, no longer McKinnon, no longer the Boston widow, but something new and strong and entirely her own, closed her eyes and dreamed of the home they'd build with their own 4 hands and stubborn hearts. In her dreams, children played by the creek, horses ran in green pastures, and always, Jacob was there, her anchor, her choice, her proof that sometimes the best things came from the worst circumstances. She'd promised to keep him alive. He'd taught her how to live. Together, they'd write a story the frontier had never seen before, not because it was easy, but because it was theirs. And that, Sarah thought as sleep claimed her, was worth everything they'd face tomorrow and all the tomorrows after. The drought came like a thief, stealing moisture from the land grain by grain until the grass turned brown as old leather and the creek dwindled to a trickle. Sarah stood on the porch of their small house, watching dust devils dance across what should have been green pasture. 3 years they'd been here, 3 years of building and hoping. And now this. 40 head, Jacob said, joining her. His face was grim beneath the dust. That's all we can hope to keep alive if this doesn't break soon. The rest... He didn't need to finish. The rest would have to be sold at whatever price they could get, if anyone was buying at all. Their carefully bred herd, the foundation of their dreams, reduced to desperate mathematics. We'll manage, Sarah said, though the words felt hollow. They'd survived so much already. Surely they could survive this too. But drought was a different enemy than winter. Slow and inexorable rather than fierce and immediate. That Sunday at church, a proper building now in the growing town of Cedar Ridge, 5 miles from their ranch, the whispers had a different quality. Not just the usual murmurs about the mixed-blood couple, but something sharper, calculating. Heard the Thorns are struggling? Sarah caught from 2 pews back. That's what comes of letting a breed try to ranch. Don't know the land like proper folk. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, but felt Jacob tense beside her. After service, fewer people than usual nodded their way. Hard times had a way of stripping away even the thin veneer of civility they'd earned. It was Marshal Henderson who brought word of the real trouble. He rode up on a Tuesday afternoon, his badge dulled by dust, his expression carefully neutral. Jacob, Mrs. Thorne. He touched his hat brim. Afraid I've got some unpleasant business. Sarah's hand found Jacob's as they stood together on their porch. What kind of business? Marshal. Randall Morton's filed a claim dispute. Says this land was promised to him before you folks settled it. He's got papers. Witnesses. Morton. Sarah knew the name. The biggest rancher in the county. The one who'd tried to buy them out twice already. A man who collected land like some collected coins, who saw their presence as a personal affront. This land was open when we claimed it, Jacob said evenly. We filed proper at the land office. You know that, Tom. The marshal shifted uncomfortably. They'd known each other before, when Jacob scouted for the army and Henderson wore sergeant's stripes, but that was before the badge, before the political pressures of a growing town. I know what I know, Henderson said carefully. But Morton's got himself a Denver lawyer. Says there was a prior verbal agreement, that the land agent made an error. He's demanding a hearing. A hearing where? Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer. Cedar Ridge Courthouse, Judge Brennan presiding. Judge Brennan, who owed his appointment to Morton's influence, who'd never hidden his views on marriages like theirs. Sarah felt the trap closing but refused to show fear. When? Jacob asked. 2 weeks. You'll want to get yourself representation. After Henderson left, they sat at their kitchen table, built by Jacob's hands from local pine, and faced the truth. Legal representation cost money they didn't have, not with the drought killing their income. The system was stacked against them from the start. We could leave, Jacob said quietly. Take what stock we can trail. Start over somewhere else. No. Sarah's voice was firm. This is our home. We've bled for it. Built it board by board. I won't let them drive us out with papers and lies. She spent the next days writing letters, calling on the few friends they'd made. The doctor from Fort Bridger had moved to Cedar Ridge. He promised to testify about their character. 2 neighboring families who'd benefited from Jacob's help with water rights agreed to speak for them. It wasn't much against Morton's money and influence, but it was something. Sarah also dove into the territorial law books, borrowed from the town's small library. She'd taught school their second year here, before prejudice and pressure forced the school board to let her go. But she'd kept her mind sharp, and now she applied it to understanding every nuance of land law. You're going to defend us yourself? Jacob asked, finding her surrounded by legal texts one midnight. Who else will? We can't afford a lawyer, and even if we could, who in Cedar Ridge would take our case against Morton? He pulled her against him, pressing a kiss to her temple. My fierce Boston lawyer. They won't know what hit them. But bravado couldn't change facts. The fire that destroyed their barn 3 nights later made that clear. They woke to the roar of flames, managed to save the horses but lost their winter hay supply, what little they'd managed to cut before the drought took hold. Sarah found the oil-soaked rags at dawn, evidence of arson clear as daylight, but when they reported it to Marshal Henderson, he seemed unsurprised. Can't prove who did it, he said. Could have been drifters. Anyone. Tom, Jacob said, his voice dangerously quiet. You know what this is. I know what I can prove in court, Henderson replied. That's all that matters now. That night, Sarah cut her hair shorter again, a practical decision, she told herself. Easier to manage with all the work. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw the woman from the mountain shack looking back. The survivor. The fighter. We've been through worse, she told her reflection, and almost believed it. The night before the hearing, unexpected visitors arrived. Sarah heard the horses first, reached for the rifle by instinct now, but the faces revealed by lamplight were familiar. 3 families from the valley beyond theirs, small ranchers like themselves. So, Mrs. Thorne, said James Chen, a Chinese immigrant who'd started with vegetables and now ran 50 head of cattle. We heard about your trouble. Behind him stood the Kowalskis, Polish farmers who'd arrived last year, and the Delgados, whose family had ranched this territory since before it was American. All of them outsiders in their own ways. All of them survivors. Morton tried this with my cousin 5 years ago. Miguel Delgado said, We didn't stand together then. He lost his land. We won't make that mistake again. They'd brought food, testimony, and something more valuable. Proof that Morton had tried similar schemes before. Papers saved from other disputes. A pattern of intimidation and legal manipulation that might sway even a biased judge. Sarah felt tears threaten for the first time in months. Why, you barely know us. We know enough, Anna Kowalski said in her accented English. You helped when the Schmidt baby was sick. Your husband, he show our men the water rights. No charge. And we know what it's like. The big man trying to crush the small. If Morton take you today, he take us tomorrow. They stayed late into the night, planning strategy. Jacob and Miguel compared notes on Morton's previous tactics. James Chen, who dealt with complex contracts in San Francisco before coming west, helped Sarah organize her legal arguments. The women cooked, turning their meager supplies into a feast that felt like hope. You realize what you're risking, Sarah said as they prepared to leave. Morton won't forget this. Neither will we, James Chen replied. Some things worth remembering, worth fighting for. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and hot. Sarah dressed in her best remaining dress, black, severe, but clean and pressed. Jacob wore his wedding suit. They looked, she thought, like what they were, people fighting for their lives with dignity as their only weapon. The courthouse was packed. Morton sat in the front row with his Denver lawyer, all confidence and expensive clothes. But behind Sarah and Jacob sat their neighbors, and behind them, others. Small ranchers, homesteaders, even some townspeople who'd grown tired of Morton's stranglehold on the county. Judge Brennan looked displeased by the crowd. He banged his gavel harder than necessary. This hearing will determine the rightful ownership of the property known as Section 12, Range 7. Mr. Pemberton for the plaintiff. Morton's lawyer was smooth as oil, painting a picture of prior claims and administrative errors. His witnesses, all Morton employees, swore to conversations that predated the Thorns' arrival. It was well rehearsed, professionally done. Then it was Sarah's turn. She stood, felt the weight of hostile and friendly eyes alike, and began. Your Honor, we have documentation from the land office showing clear title. We have tax receipts for 3 years of payment. We have improvements made, a house, fencing, water rights properly filed. She laid out each piece of evidence methodically, her teacher's training serving her well. But it was when she departed from pure law that the room shifted. More than that. Your Honor, we have truth, Mr. Morton has attempted this before. I have here documentation of similar claims against the Chen, Delgado, and Kowalski properties, all withdrawn when challenged. This is not about rightful ownership. This is about power, and whether the law serves justice or merely the powerful. Mrs. Thorne, the judge warned. Please confine yourself to the matter at hand. This is the matter at hand. Your Honor, if a man can use wealth and influence to steal what others have built with honest labor, then law means nothing. My husband and I have bled for our land. We've survived drought and prejudice and now arson. Yes, our barn was burned 3 nights ago, though I'm sure that's mere coincidence. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Morton's face darkened. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. We've asked for no charity, no special treatment, only the right to keep what we've earned. If that right depends on the color of a man's skin or the depth of his pockets rather than the content of his character and the sweat of his brow, then perhaps it's not our claim that should be questioned, but the very foundation of justice in Cedar Ridge. The silence when she finished was profound. Then, from the back of the room, applause started. One person, then another, until Judge Brennan was banging his gavel furiously. Order, I'll have order, or clear the court. The crowd settled, but something had shifted. The judge looked uncomfortable now, aware perhaps that too blatant a bias would have consequences beyond this courtroom. I'll review the evidence, he said finally. Court reconvene tomorrow at 10 for my decision. That night, Sarah and Jacob sat on their porch, watching the stars, win or lose. They'd fought, they'd stood up, and they hadn't stood alone. Whatever happens, Jacob said, I'm proud to be your husband. And I'm proud to be your wife, Sarah replied, though I prefer Sarah Thorne, rancher, to Sarah Thorne, lawyer. Why's that? Less talking, more doing. She smiled. The first real smile in weeks. Though I did enjoy seeing Morton's face when the Delgados walked in. You were magnificent. Jacob said simply, You've always been magnificent. From that first night in the shack when you refused to let me die. We saved each other, Sarah corrected. We're still saving each other. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. But tonight, surrounded by the land they'd claimed and cultivated, supported by neighbors who'd become allies, Sarah and Jacob Thorne faced the future as they always had, together, unafraid, and absolutely certain that their love was worth any fight the world demanded. The drought would break or it wouldn't. The judge would rule for or against them, but they would endure, because that's what survivors did. That's what lovers did. That's what partners did. And if Morton thought one rigged hearing would break them, he'd forgotten the most important lesson of the frontier. Those who'd already lost everything and survived had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The courthouse filled early, townspeople arriving before the doors even opened. Sarah noticed faces she hadn't expected. The minister's wife who'd always crossed the street to avoid them. The banker who'd denied their loan application twice. Something had shifted in Cedar Ridge overnight, though whether toward justice or mere spectacle remained to be seen. Judge Brennan entered looking haggard, as if he'd spent a sleepless night. His eyes avoided Morton's corner of the room as he took his seat. "In the matter of Morton versus Thorne," he began, his voice lacking its usual authority, "this court has reviewed all evidence presented." Sarah felt Jacob's hand find hers beneath the table. Whatever came, they would face it as they'd faced everything else. While Mr. Morton's claim has certain merits. The judge continued, and Sarah's heart sank. The documentation provided by the defendants is substantial and properly filed. Moreover, the pattern of similar claims brought to this court's attention raises questions about the plaintiff's motivations. Morton's lawyer started to rise, but Brennan waved him down. "However," the judge said, and that single word hung in the air like smoke, "this court cannot ignore certain irregularities in the original land filing." Sarah stood. "Your Honor, what irregularities our filing was accepted by the Territorial Office?" "Mrs. Thorne, you'll have your chance to respond." Brennan shuffled papers unnecessarily. "It seems the land agent who processed your claim may have exceeded his authority. There are questions about whether the property was truly open for settlement at the time." It was a masterful political maneuver, not ruling entirely for Morton, which would have been too blatant, but creating enough doubt to justify almost any decision. Sarah felt the trap closing but refused to surrender. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "if there were irregularities, they were unknown to us. We filed in good faith. We've improved the land, paid taxes, been productive members of this community despite considerable resistance. To punish us for an administrative error we had no part in would be unjust." Nevertheless, Brennan continued, "This court must consider all factors. Therefore, I'm ordering a territorial review of the land claim. Until such review is complete, the property will be held in trust." "By whom?" Jacob spoke for the first time, his voice cutting through the judge's political dancing. Brennan hesitated. "By a court-appointed administrator." "Oh, let me guess." Miguel Delgado called from the gallery. "Someone Mr. Morton recommends." "Order!" Brennan banged his gavel. But the damage was done. The crowd saw the game clearly now. That's when young Timothy Chen, James's 16-year-old son, stood up in the back row. "Judge Brennan, sir, I saw something. 3 nights ago, when the Thornes' barn burned." The courtroom went silent. Timothy was known as a truthful boy, hard-working and serious beyond his years. "This is highly irregular," Morton's lawyer protested. "So is burning down barns," someone called out. "Let the boy speak," said Reverend Michaels, surprising everyone. The minister had never been friendly to the Thornes, but apparently, arson crossed a line even for him. Timothy came forward, nervous but determined. "I was checking our fence line that night. We share a boundary with the Thornes. I saw 2 men riding away from the direction of the fire. Their horses had Morton Ranch brands." "That proves nothing," Morton snarled, forgetting himself. "My men could have been anywhere." At 2 a.m, Anna Kowalski asked. "During calving season, when every hand is needed." The crowd stirred, murmuring growing louder. Brennan pounded his gavel repeatedly, but order was slipping away. "Furthermore," Timothy continued, his voice gaining strength, "I heard one of them say, that should give them something to think about before tomorrow. Tomorrow was the hearing, sir." "This is hearsay." Morton's lawyer insisted. A child's testimony, uncorroborated. I can corroborate it. Everyone turned as a new voice spoke from the doorway. Sarah gasped. It was Henderson, the marshal, his badge glinting in the morning light. "Tom," Jacob said, disbelief clear in his voice. Henderson walked forward, his face grim. "I've been investigating the barn fire. Found tracks, just like the boys said. Followed them right to Morton's spread. Also found this." He produced a silver flask, engraved with initials. "Belongs to Wade Hutchins, Morton's foreman. Must have fallen from his pocket in the excitement." The courtroom erupted. Morton was on his feet, shouting at his lawyer, at Henderson, at the judge. His carefully maintained facade of respectability cracked like drought-baked earth. "You can't prove that flask was at the fire," he raged. "This is conspiracy. That Breed and his woman have turned you all against me." "Mr. Morton," Brennan hammered desperately, "you will control yourself." But Morton was beyond control. "I've run this county for 15 years. I won't be brought down by a half-breed and a Boston whore who—" The slap echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Sarah stood before Morton, her hand still raised, her face calm as a mountain lake. "You may insult me all you wish," she said quietly, "but you will not speak so of my husband." Morton raised his hand as if to strike back, but suddenly Jacob was there, catching Morton's wrist in a grip that made the rancher cry out. "Touch her," Jacob said, his voice deadly soft, "and you'll answer to me. Not in court, not with lawyers, the old way." "That's enough." Judge Brennan found his voice at last. "Marshal, arrest Mr. Morton for conspiracy to commit arson. This hearing is concluded. The Thorne claim stands as filed. Court dismissed." The crowd surged forward, but Sarah had eyes only for Jacob. They stood in the chaos, holding each other, as 3 years of fear and struggle finally broke like fever. "We won," she whispered against his chest. "We actually won." "You won," he corrected, pulling back to look at her. "You magnificent, brave, brilliant woman. You won." Later, after Morton had been led away in irons, after the congratulations and backslapping, after the strange sensation of being welcomed by people who'd shunned them for years, Sarah and Jacob sat on the courthouse steps. Why did Henderson change his mind? Sarah wondered aloud. The marshal himself answered, having overheard, "Didn't change my mind. Just finally found my spine." He sat beside them, looking older than his years. "I've been in Morton's pocket too long. When I saw that flask, knew what it meant. Well, a man's got to be able to look at himself in the mirror." "What changed?" Jacob asked. Henderson was quiet for a moment. "Watching you two at the hearing yesterday, the way you stood up, even knowing the deck was stacked, the way your neighbors stood with you, made me remember why I put on this badge in the first place." He stood, touched his hat brim. "Town owes you an apology. I owe you an apology. Don't expect you to forgive, but wanted it said." After he left, Sarah and Jacob sat in companionable silence, watching Cedar Ridge go about its business. The town looked different somehow, or perhaps it was just their place in it that had changed. "What now?" Sarah asked. "Now we go home." Jacob said simply, "We rebuild the barn. We wait for rain. We raise horses and maybe children. We live." That simple and that complicated. He took her hand, traced the calluses that had replaced soft city skin. "We've won the right to try. That's all anyone can ask." They retrieved their wagon from the livery, where the owner charged them half price and mumbled something about community solidarity. As they drove out of town, people nodded, waved, offered tentative smiles. Not everyone. Some faces remained cold, some hearts unchanged. But enough. More than enough. The road home wound through land baked brown by drought, past struggling ranches and failed dreams, But Sarah saw it differently now. She saw the strength it took to stay, to fight, to build something from nothing but will and work. Look, Jacob pointed ahead. Clouds were building on the western horizon. Real clouds, heavy with promise. The air smelled different, charged with possibility. They reached their ranch as the first drops fell. Fat, heavy drops that kicked up dust and drummed on their wagon canvas. By the time they'd unhitched the horses, it was pouring, the kind of drenching rain that could save the grass, fill the creek, wash away 3 months of despair. Sarah stood in their yard, arms spread wide, letting the rain soak through her courthouse dress. Jacob joined her, and they laughed like children, spinning in the mud, tasting salvation on their tongues. We survived the drought. Sarah gasped between laughter and rain. We survived Morton. We survived everything. We, Jacob repeated, catching her against him. I like the sound of that. I've always liked the sound of that. They kissed in the rain. There in the yard of the ranch they'd fought to keep. Behind them, their house stood solid despite everything thrown at it. Before them, the land drank deeply of the rain's gift. And between them, love flowed as certain as the creek that was already beginning to sing again. Tomorrow there would be work, the barn to rebuild, damage to repair, relationships to mend or forge anew. Morton's trial would bring its own challenges. The drought might return. Other troubles would certainly find them. But today, in this moment, Sarah and Jacob Thorne stood in the rain on their own land, proven by fire and law, and knew themselves wealthy beyond measure. They'd fought for this ground, bled for it, nearly lost it. Now it was theirs in a way it had never been before, not just by paper and filing, but by right of courage, persistence, and the simple refusal to let go. I love you, Sarah said, rain streaming down her face like tears of joy. And I love you, Jacob replied, forever and regardless. Forever and regardless. It might have been their motto all along, Sarah thought. And as the rain washed the land clean and started their world anew, she couldn't imagine any better words to build a life upon. 20 years had passed like seasons, some harsh, some gentle, all leaving their marks on the land and the people who worked it. Sarah stood on the porch of their expanded house, watching her eldest son Matthew work with a young stallion in the corral. He had his father's patience with horses, his mother's quick mind for business. He's got the touch, Jacob said, joining her. His hair was silver-threaded now, his face lined by sun and time, but his eyes were still the green of deep forests, like his old man. Better, Sarah corrected, leaning into his warmth. He's got your skill and my stubbornness. Dangerous combination. Their twin daughters, Rebecca and Ruth, 19 and sharp as tacks, were in the kitchen going over the ranch books. They'd inherited their mother's head for figures and their father's easy way with people, a powerful blend that had helped the Thorne Ranch become one of the most successful in the county. Ma, Rebecca called through the window. Letter from California, from Aunt Margaret. Sarah's sister had finally made the journey east 2 summers ago, expecting to find Sarah diminished by frontier life. Instead, she'd found a woman transformed, strong, confident, utterly at home in her skin. The visit had been awkward at first, then surprisingly healing. She's coming for Christmas, Sarah announced, reading quickly, bringing her new husband. Poor man, Jacob murmured, meeting the frontier thorns. Hope he's prepared. Sarah swatted him playfully, but her mind was already elsewhere. In 3 days, they were making a journey of their own, back to the mountain shack where it all began. The idea had been Jacob's. 20 years, he'd said one night. Seems fitting to go back, see where we started. Now, as they prepared for the trip, Sarah felt a mix of anticipation and something deeper, a need to touch that beginning again, to remember who they'd been before becoming who they were. They left the ranch in Matthew's capable hands, taking only what they needed for a week's journey. The trail was easier now. Proper roads part of the way. The rest familiar from years of living on the land. But as they climbed higher, leaving civilization behind, Sarah felt time folding in on itself. There, Jacob pointed to a canyon mouth. Remember, that's where the stage was attacked. Sarah remembered. The terror, the blood, the moment when everything changed. I thought you were dying, she said softly. I was, until you decided otherwise. They found the shack on the third day, following landmarks Jacob had never forgotten. It stood like a monument to endurance, weathered beyond measure but still upright, still offering shelter to whatever soul might need it. Sarah pushed open the door that hung better than it had 20 years ago. Some traveler had fixed it. Inside, ghosts of memory danced in the dust beams. The stone fireplace, black with decades of smoke. The corner where the cot had been. The table, now broken completely, where she'd tended his wounds. It's smaller than I remembered, she said, voice hushed as if in church. We're bigger, Jacob replied. Look. He pointed to marks on the doorframe, scratches they'd made to count days, still visible beneath newer marks from other refugees of storm or circumstance. On the wall, barely legible. Someone had carved J&S Thorne, survived. You did that? Sarah asked, tracing the letters. The day we left, wanted to leave something, proof we'd been here. They spent the day cleaning, repairing what they could. Sarah found remnants of their time, a button from her dress, the head of the arrow that had nearly killed Jacob, preserved by some traveler who'd recognized its significance. As the sun set, they built a fire in the old fireplace, spreading their bedrolls where the cot had been. Tell me, Sarah said, lying in his arms as darkness fell. Tell me what you really thought that first night. Jacob was quiet for a moment. I thought I was dreaming. Thought death had sent me an angel. Only she was bossy and determined and wouldn't let me go peacefully. He kissed her temple. Best dream I ever had. I was terrified, Sarah admitted. Not just of you dying, of what saving you meant. I knew even then that if you lived, my old life was over. Regrets. Never, not once. She turned to face him. That woman, that proper Boston widow, she was dying slowly anyway. You didn't just let me save your life. You saved mine right back. They talked through the night, voices echoing off the same walls that had heard their first tentative conversations. They spoke of their children, their struggles, the years of slowly earning acceptance in Cedar Ridge. Morton had served 5 years for the arson, his empire crumbling. Some of his land had been divided among the small ranchers he'd tried to crush. The town's changing, Jacob observed. More folks like the Chens and Kowalskis, mixed families, different ways. We helped change it, Sarah said, by staying, by refusing to be driven out. You changed it. That day in court, people still talk about it. The proper lady who slapped Randall Morton and faced down a rigged system. We changed it, Sarah corrected. Together, like everything else. Morning came soft and golden through the gaps in the walls. They made coffee on the old fireplace. Ate biscuits Sarah had baked for the journey. Simple fare that tasted of memory. I want to leave something, Sarah said suddenly. For the next ones who need this place. She pulled out her journal. She'd never stopped writing, documenting their life in careful script. On a fresh page, she wrote, To whoever finds shelter here, this shack saved our lives in the winter of 1871. We were strangers then, thrown together by violence and storm. We left as husband and wife, beginning a life that seemed impossible. Whatever brought you here, know this survival is possible. Hope is possible. Even love is possible. In the most unlikely places. Hold on. Spring always comes. Sarah and Jacob Thorne, 1891. She tucked the page into a crack in the wall where it would be protected but visible. Jacob added something of his own. The wooden comb he'd carved for her all those years ago, wrapped in oilcloth with a note, made with love in dark times. May it serve you as it served us." They stood in the doorway one last time, looking back at the rough shelter that had been their crucible. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to the empty room, "for everything." The journey home was quiet, both lost in thought. But as their ranch came into view, the house expanded, the barn sturdy, the corrals full of fine horses. Sarah felt the rightness of it all. The thread connecting that desperate winter night to this prosperous present was unbroken, woven through every choice they'd made. Matthew met them at the gate. "Everything go all right? You find what you were looking for?" Sarah and Jacob exchanged glances. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "We found exactly what we were looking for." That evening, the whole family gathered for dinner. Rebecca had made pot roast. Ruth had baked bread. Matthew regaled them with stories of the ranch work. It was loud and warm and real, a far cry from the silent, proper dinners of Sarah's first marriage. "Tell us again," Ruth requested, as she had since childhood, about the winter in the mountains. So they told it again, but differently now, not as a story of mere survival, but as a love story. A story of two people who found each other in the space between heartbeats and chose to keep finding each other, every day, for 20 years and counting. Later, as they prepared for bed in their comfortable room, such luxury compared to that narrow cot, Jacob pulled Sarah close. "Would you do it again?" he asked, knowing everything that would come. The hard years, the prejudice, the struggles. Sarah didn't hesitate. "Every time. In every life, I would always choose you. Forever and regardless. Forever and regardless." Outside, the horses called to each other in the darkness. The creek sang its endless song. And in the house that love built, Sarah and Jacob Thorne held each other close, grateful for the storm that had brought them together and for every storm they'd weathered since. In the mountains, an empty shack stood ready for the next desperate souls who would need its shelter, and tucked into its walls, a testament weighted proof that sometimes the worst circumstances could forge the strongest love. That survival was possible. That spring always came. Just as Sarah had promised on that long-ago night, "I'll keep you alive." They had kept each other alive, in all the ways that mattered, and they would continue to do so. Forever and regardless, until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust. Thank you for listening to this story of love and survival from the Wild West. We'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps on your own adventure? Please subscribe to our channel From Wild West and share your thoughts about Sarah and Jacob's journey in the comments below. Your stories and reflections make our community richer. Until next time, partners.